Merlin Seller. I'm currently lecturing in design and screen cultures at University of Edinburgh. My research interests in game studies with background in art history, currently focused on representations and articulations of plant life, temporality, and the non-human more broadly. In discussing human-non-human relationships in games, I'm here hoping to add a little to the excellent work of Krzysztof Jański concerning animality, Lenda Chang concerning ecology, and drawing on Timothy Morton's thinking regarding dark ecology, which he frames as a kind of post-romantic awareness of the complex chaos and contradictions of ecology when appreciated at multiple scales. This paper critically reads a real-time strategy game, pictured here, as a historiographic model with a dark ecological perspective on both the deep time and speculative future of the climate crisis. In contrast to the competitive, growth-oriented nationalist framing of player factions in series such as Civilization, the environmental strategy game Lichenia by Molindustria addresses climate crisis history as a post-zero-sum game, in which the player manages the conflicting demands of a global biosphere, containing both human and non-human actants. Here I perform a close reading and art historical analysis of Lichenia in relation to the Annales School of Historiography, which emphasizes broad-scale international and ecological history, and the concept of the longue durée, history read in terms of long-term dynamics. More recent endeavors have explored the pedagogic function of historically themed games, see Key and Campeau 2014, and reflected on both the AAA narrative-driven and traditional strategy games seen as historical representations, see Capel and Elliott 2013 and Chapman 2016. There's still much work, I think, to be done on games as embodiments of the theory and philosophy of history, particularly in the indie space. Lichenia offers the player a highly effective looping experience of development and rewilding, flood and drought, growth and death, which I argue contrasts the linear progress narratives of conventional strategy games with dark existential rhythms that challenge the primacy of humanity and expose the untamable complexity of a climate in sympathy with Timothy Morton's dark ecology. First, I'll contextualize Lichenia a bit within the medium and in relation to game studies. Second, I'll turn to historiographic and anthropological contexts before finally bringing things together in a kind of extended conclusion on chaotic deep time and recent ecological philosophy. First, game gardening in the end times. Both Will Wright and Molindustria write about their city models as kinds of garden. While Wright might imagine his garden city or city gardening as careful pruning in the tradition of utopian urban development from the pre- and interwar garden city movement, for example, Lichenia envisages instead urban gardening as much more symbiotic in the mode of its namesake, the co-organism of algae and fungi, lichen. Lichenia then sits in contrast to other recent ecologically minded strategy games like Terra Nil, which charts a more linear positivist narrative of restoring diversity to a generic wasteland, and so positions Lichenia closer to something like Cloud Gardens, in which players aid plant life in reclaiming the spaces of an urban post-apocalypse. Unlike its peers, however, Lichenia looks at larger scales of time and space, dystopian gardening on the scale of whole centuries and societies. In Games of Empire, Dyer Witherford and Deputer famously ground historical game simulations of urban life in the context of neoliberal empire, territorializing, essentializing spaces where players dominate environments. Molindustria explicitly aims to complicate the colonialist fantasy of an empty or uninhabited landscape preceding player intervention, prevalent in the work of Will Wright and Sid Meier. Both its asset pipeline and UI signal the repeated interrelation of human and non-human, with neural network generated tile sprites developed by Everest Pipkin and descriptions of the land as uncanny plastic stratigraphy and concrete shards in a post-post apocalypse. One could explore Lichenia in the context of changing historical conceptions of the future or the apocalypse, as in Joseph November's work on Fallout, where by contrast, Lichenia's articulation of repeated structures of deep time, to give Martin Rothberg's sense there, and speculative futures look beyond the finality and linearity of the apocalyptic, and in ways which complicate the doctrine of manifest destiny present in Bethesda's latest work. While Markus Schulzke argues for the critical effectiveness of bleak and nihilistic dystopias in his essay, The Critical Power of Virtual Dystopias, Trey Andrea Russworm, building the work of Baccalidi and Moylan, argues for the necessity to build critical but positive dystopias in games, with which historical context and utopian aspiration might temper the present-focused, abject, and overdetermined dystopias of neoliberal media, in which problems are insoluble and alternatives cannot be imagined. Dar Witherford and Deputer here agree that the shortcomings of simulated worlds come from their inability to imagine alternatives, and that with a historical mindset and outlook, we need to explore the contingency of history and historical agency of the multitude to build more powerful and liberatory temporal and spatial visions in our games. We're given a three-way choice in Lichenia: voluntary self-extinction, pursuit of the destructive ways of our present and the game's future past, or the fostering of a new kind of equilibrium. With nothing more than these pictured instructions, we carefully poke and prod at the pulsating tiles that flesh out this world, more a kind of material alchemy than science, testing for results. Sound design here becomes a key component of the minimal player feedback, predominantly taking the form of diegetic bird song, upset by the occasional static-filled electronica of weather effects and disasters. If we overdevelop, however, destroying plant life, eventually the bird song is silenced. As a critical response to Age of Empires, SimCity, and Civilization, Lichenia continues by ludic means the scholarly critiques leveled at these traditional historical building simulators by Krasnitska and Siegel, respectively, as imperialist and positivist progress model kind of history. Lichenia frames civilization as a perpetual balancing act of environmental stimulus and response through a procedural rhetoric that moves the player effectively from anxiety to humility and acceptance. Floods and storms erode player-built infrastructure, just as plant life can process and replenish devastation. Rain, fire, foliage, and urban development are equally weighted materials here, which inflect each other in complex and often opaque interactions. And while the player might aim to foster a dynamic equilibrium, the world's impermanence reinforces the fragility, mutability, and ineffability of both architecture and ecosystems at large enough temporal scales. Diverging from Levy and Dawson's model of pedagogic history games concerned with climate, as kinds of visual archive of vanishing ecosystems, Lichenia instead represents global ecosystems in flux through mechanics. Conversely, while Adam Chapman's work practically demonstrates the power of systems to represent historical affordances systemically, his approach foregrounds player freedom, where Lichenia engages in a radical restriction of player power. In contrast then to these American models of games as history, therefore argue we should instead turn to different historiographic tradition in order to begin articulating Lichenia's systems-based approach to climate history. Through game dynamics, Lichenia plays with and against the different generations of analytical historiography, as well as cultural theorists on its periphery, from Fernand Braudèl's notion of climate as a slow but omnipresent historical force, l'histoire quasi-immobile, to more recent post-humanist ecological theory. And thinking and acting through both the quotidian social rhythms and construction and detritus, as well as the long-term environmental tides of which they are a part, Lichenia's dark rhythmic game dynamics not only complicate ontological categories of natural artificial, but also temporal categories of deep and recent time, longue durée and histoire événementielle. We see this as a historiography of three layers, scales of history in Braudèl's epic The Mediterranean and the Mediterranean World in the Age of Philip II, centuries-long cycles, often predicated on climate, the mid-term socioeconomic, and the short term of contemporary events. But it's important to note that Braudèl too vacillates on whether climate change can be considered longue durée or événementielle, even in the context of early modernity, pointing to areas of rapid change locally in coastlines and glaciation, contrasting with other regions of continuity. To quote Braudèl, "So the climate changes and does not change. It varies in relation to norms, which after all may vary themselves," unquote. Everything for Braudèl is potentially in flux, as in Lichenia, and by switching between scalar levels, the works of the analysis school has proven prescient and productive for more recent theory and writing in the age of climate crises and complex hyperobjects such as global warming. Indeed, as Pfister et al. Write, most subsequent historical climatology has focused on early modern Europe, building on the pioneering work of historians like Braudèl. What Braudèl and Bloch speak to in European history is not only a contextual awareness of the anthropogenic, i.e. human-produced landscape, absent from American simulations like Age of Empires, but also a key terrain of the historical engine Timothy Morton terms agrilogistics. In Timothy Morton's dark ecology, this is perhaps the longest durational paradigm in the post-Neolithic world, the scalable extraction of resources from the flattening and homogenizing of ecosystems, in other words, farming, which suppresses the chaotic looping forces of nature to programmatic linear plans of human production. Like the tides of history, Lichenia reflects on recent history as a process, one which is always already ancient, referencing the Anthropocene as a both once recent and also always ongoing in the memory of the communal society evoked by the game. It's no coincidence that Lichenia describes its core loop as a critical approach to gardening. Agrilogistics, the relation of plants to cities, is the history Lichenia tells and unpacks through its elegant mechanics. The player selects and drops elements onto the topography: plants, roads, water, buildings, fire, alchemically experimenting with forces which only reveal themselves through play. Plants are susceptible to heat and fire, water evaporates if it isn't collected in large bodies, and conurbations die without surrounding areas of foliage. Only trial and error over time will reveal their interactions and legacies for local tiles and the field of play as a whole. Through these processes, players experience systemic interaction, remediating the ruins of the past and stirring the local chemistry of the present, playing with time and space. As Rodell poetically describes the rhythm and interrelation of historical forces, all these movements are superimposed on one another. They all govern the life of man, which is never simple. A man cannot build without founding his actions consciously or not on their ebb and flow. The activity of building in Lichenia constitutes an intervention in the historical landscape, conjured through comic and poignant rubrics. As Simon Schama argues, landscapes, as we perceive them, are historical and constructed, not just natural aggregations of objects. The landscape is the work of the mind. Its scenery is built up as much from the strata of memory as from layers of rock. In W.J.T. Mitchell's terms, landscape is a cultural medium, technology that can foster ideologies of nationhood and affordances of resource extraction, feeding into ahistorical primordialist nationalisms in games like Civilization, as critiqued by Stefan Donecker, in which states are somehow read as continuous and natural. In Lichenia, however, the landscape is the product of multiple excavating species across time: human and machine and plant. We are the changing landscape, not an avatar dominating an idealized ahistorical faction. This construction is a collaboration, one made between humans moving and cleansing bodies of water, plants eroding concrete, and human settlement parasitizing plant matter, rather than the imposition of architectural blueprints. Human agency, reflected in player agency, is here indirect, mediated by materials. We choose to locally propagate algorithms to construct the landscape with itself. We try to balance the water table and replant after bushfires, as well as fostering symbioses of elements. Combining plant and water tiles creates wetlands to preserve bodies of water. This is as crucial to any architecture made of stone as any architecture made of stone, and often outlasts human conurbations in the game. As a result, the historical legacy the player leaves behind in the game is often supplanting the petrochemical strata with new kinds of biotechnology. But crucially, the game reads both as anthropogenic and neither as permanent. Wetlands eventually decline and are processed by new architectures, fires, and floods. Moreover, on an aesthetic level, the production of the tile set reflects a parallel human-non-human collaboration between a designer, Everest Pipkin, a historical data set, the pixel aesthetics of previous indie games, and a machine learning neural network, composting and recomposing digital stratigraphy. This aggregate of imagination, of cultural construction and materiality is exemplified in embedded literal elements of what Jenkins calls environmental storytelling, evocative text that reflects on our relationship to the landscape, pointing to the detritus of the old world and the complexity of the present with randomized location markers. But this cryptic ecology is not the omniscient and abstract sense of space that Gordon Kalea identifies in strategic games of miniatures. Instead, we feel the surface, a living plane which we identify with as much as we manipulate. We are both antagonist and protagonist, with no fail or no win condition. We are pests and pollinators, crops and weeds. The anthropologist Tim Ingold emphasizes the importance of both temporality and materiality to understanding how notions of landscape change. Central argument stresses that historians need to critically overcome a false distinction between the concept of the landscape as an objective reality as viewed as a complete cultural construct. Neither, he argues, is a sufficient explanation of landscapes as they exist. Instead, he appeals to dwelling as a model for thinking through landscape. Landscape as we experience it is anthropogenic, doesn't exist before it is altered by human presence, and could be better described as a taskscape, a kind of archive of labor. Ingold argues that every landscape is both natural and a cultural landscape, in the senses used by landscape archaeology, and the constant churn of geography in Lichenia explores this fully. For every hole dug in one location, there is a mound made in another. There is no neutral state. Landscape remains stubbornly material, thing-like, but also always in a process of becoming with other objects and peoples. With Ingold, we can see that Lichenia represents landscape as a player's verb, a material process constantly articulating human and non-human activity, an ecosystem that unfolds us. If, as Mark Bonner argues in early modernity in video games, game architecture usually functions as a clear signifying shell dropped in the landscape, serially produced and serially producing production facilities, seen in games like Rise of Nations or Age of Empires, then the dream-like architecture of Lichenia is hard to parse, semi-randomized and non-productive. It is material fused and suffused with the organic and inorganic tiles around it. Rather than master planner, the player is deliberately positioned as a gardener stuck deep in the weeds. Through this positioning, what at first seems to be a bird's eye view of the world as a kind of microcosm is actually what Linda Chang might refer to as a deeply tactile mesocosm of the temporal landscape, framing ecological awareness as something practical, mid-level, and messy. Now, by way of an extended conclusion. As Adam Curtis explores in All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, biologist John Kircher argues in The Balance of Nature, Ecology's Enduring Myth, there is no perfect balance in nature. That ideal is a fantasy of the self-perpetuating and self-maintaining natural idyll inherited from the ancient Greeks. Through flood, heat wave, fire, and the dynamic properties of every tile, Lichenia prevents the player from achieving a perfect equilibrium. Every state is provisional, contingent, and mutable. Too compacted, and a city starves. Too diffuse, and it dissipates. Living with nature is playing with patience and flexibility. The closest to an optimal strategy one might take is a compartmentalized space oriented towards wetland-shielded bodies of water, but even this demands constant mediating work between plant, water, and stone, digesting broken architecture and reseeding the periphery. Where in previous games, nature is represented as external, Lichenia reveals nature to have a history, what Rodwick terms deep time, in an urban simulation. While Lichenia's accompanying text describes it as a lesson in, quote, sustainable development, in practice, the game is less prescriptive of a stable future than a document of the long duration of dark, more than human ecologies. In the game's diegetic text, quote, no amount of care could stop its vicious feedbacks. Collectively, Lichenia's mechanics and aesthetics generate a tremor of what Timothy Morton calls a being quake, upsetting humanity's centralities of the world, providing space for what Linda Chang calls interaction across scalar levels. In doing so, it manifests the truly global problematics of vast historical forces ebbing and flowing in the Anthropocene, which Morton has termed unsustainable resource extractive agrologistics. In its magnitude and returns, Lichenia enacts some of the scale and horror of this civilizational hyperobject, in which humanity has struggled counterproductively for millennia to flatten the vast and irrational feedback loops of the biosphere. Through its dynamics, Lichenia fosters ecological awareness, or in Morton's terms, ecognosis, and transitions the player rapidly from dark depression through the dark uncanny and into the dark sweetness of play, in which we come to terms with the dizzying, ungraspable complexity of looping coexistence and interdependence, precarious, lichen-like symbiosis. Becoming with the landscape, we are a tactile membrane of contingent agency, in marked contrast to the managerial perspective of other historical strategy games. Here we feel the friction of global historical forces as looping affective rhythms of a human, non-human ecosystem we participate in. Pursuing an evocative and affective approach to time, it works, I think, a little in sympathy with Mark Bloch's injunction in The Historian's Craft. Quote, let us guard against stripping our science of its share of poetry. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this